Welcome to Come and See, your podcast for finding truth in a world of chaos. Brought to you by Living Waters Abide Ministries. With host and founder, Richard Case, and co-host and retreat leader, Kathy Ricconi. Jesus reminds us to watch for the signs of his return. Today, we will explore further what we are seeing in our times that line up with what signs he said would indicate the potential of the end and his return. We will also discuss the practical meaning of this as we watch and as a remnant prepare as he so leads. And now your host, Richard Case.
Well, good morning, everybody. This is End Times Friday, and we're excited, very excited to have our good friend Denny. This will be airing, I believe, September the 10th. We've had Eric and Rabbi on the 4 weeks before this, and there was so much going on in Israel that we needed to keep asking them questions. Because it's amazing, by the way, how privileged we are to have all that detailed information that is clear and helpful to us. And so we thought this would be a good time for this session and next session to have Denny, who can help synthesize and come to some understanding about, okay, all that we've started to learn in the detail of it, what does it all mean? And one thing we talked about this morning is that because of all of the worldwide discussion about peace and Trump and Putin and Ukraine, that's a big story. You know, where does that, couple questions, where do you think that's going to go? And then two is it puts Israel a little bit in the background for the moment. But we know it won't remain there. So we got to look at the implications of that. So Denny, I know that you kind of have this thought. Maybe you could phrase it up really well, and then what are some of your thoughts about that?
So I was reflecting on the news cycle and where all of the energy is right now. And to me, it was characterized by all these Western leaders last minute dropping everything and flying to DC for essentially a summit with Trump. And we're hearing about all of that, but it seems like that is a major worldwide event. It doesn't happen very often. And, we even think back on how much air there was between Western leaders and Trump. It's not like these are all traditional allies and friends. This has been a tense relationship because of all of the trade actions that the Trump administration has taken. But they all showed up there, and this is all about Ukraine and Russia, and no reporting about really any discussions beyond that. So the unfinished business in the Middle East is still unfinished business in the midst of all that.
Yeah.
And it made me wonder whether or not that is all that's going on this, or whether or not the reason there's such urgency around this meeting is there's a belief that there is a face-to-face that is developing between Putin and Trump. That's really what is going on, and that neither side will blink. And then so we'll be left with, well, how will that warring or how will that dispute play out? Trump has pretty much said that if Putin doesn't yield to an agreement with Ukraine, then hard sanctions and all of that follow. And so that was what was on the top of my mind. I don't know whether you guys have thoughts on that, but it seems to me there is something that is really brewing that if it plays out in the wrong way, will keep the Gaza hostage, Israel, Hamas conversation in the background.
Yeah. From a biblical perspective, as you look at the end times that's explained in Daniel and Ezekiel and Revelation, there's an entities called Gog and Magog. And from what historians say about that is that would be, in essence, Russia and Asia or China that lead ultimately the world against Israel. And of course, the other ones in the Middle East will join them. And even America either joins them or is impotent or gone. We're not mentioned as a major player in that sequence. So we know a couple things. Russia is there and is a major player. And therefore, whatever happens today meaning the next month or two or three, it's not really going to diminish Russia to nothing. Because they actually are something. And from what I can tell, and I have been watching this, is that Trump has a certain let's say, style of negotiation, which is very severe threats and then backing down from some of those threats to come to a point where he's satisfied and the other party has to capitulate to some level and do something. Like I'll give you a simple example where, they threw tariffs at Canada. And Canada came back and said, okay, well, then we're going to tariff these things. And Trump said, okay, then I'll just double the tariffs. And they said, okay, sorry. We're not going to do that. And they capitulated back out of it. Well, what we saw here with Trump and Putin is that they met in Alaska. Trump made his threats, which, by the way, isn't military because we don't have the ability to do that, I don't think. So it's really economic. We don't know what happened during that discussion, but we do know that the day after, Putin doubled his effort in Ukraine to fight against them. So it's like, I don't really care what you say. I'm going to go ahead and go through it. Now, Trump is making a threat. I think he's going to have to execute that threat if he's going to have any credibility to the world. I personally don't think it's going to have a big effect because I'm not sure the world is willing to accept or surrender to that deep sanctions. I think Europe will just say they will, but they won't. And I don't think it'll impact Russia in a big way. And then it'll be interesting to see what happens. But the whole story is really around that. And that the whole discussion of the Middle East is not even on the table right now. So it seems like it's going to come out with that. I personally don't think Trump will be successful in this particular negotiation like he has been because the opponent has the same ego that he's got. And they think they can withstand it, I believe.
Yeah. So there is a sense this will get slowed down in the next steps. There's already talk yesterday about some of the senior ministers in Russia saying, well, wait a minute, it doesn't work that way that the two leaders just do something. It now has to go through the mill. And so there will probably be scheduled this meeting somewhere with the Ukrainian leader and with the Russian leader. And it'll probably be frustrating, probably get drawn out in time. It'll probably be frustrating. And then there'll be another step after that. Maybe, Trump joins. And so you can see this thing beginning to sort of grind out. And in the meantime, just as you said, the battle continues because this is all about land boundaries to Russia.
Yeah.
So any gains they can make, he's going to view that as a negotiating principle. I suspect that Trump will follow through with substantial sanctions, and he might be able to compel India to stop buying oil from Russia, and and that kind of thing that he does. That is, you've seen him do second order, but that's probably where the battle will occur. So then you say, all right, in the midst of all of that, and where is Europe in all of this? They're shoring up some kind of an agreement to sort of hold their nose and not really let Ukraine into NATO, but to give them some kind of equivalency and continuing financial aid so they can continue to battle. It just drags this thing out. That's sort of what it feels like.
Yeah. And there is one interesting thing that happened. This is last week. Saudi Arabia just did a deal with Russia.
Interesting.
On both receiving and shipping oil and other goods, and they negotiated it while this is all going on. Like Saudi Arabia is the kingpin of Middle East, and they just did a deal with Russia. So I think Russia either has things in place or knows of things in place that we don't know. And I think the game is going to be played out differently than we think, because I think we make certain assumptions about Russia, and I don't think they're correct. So it's going to be an interesting play of, where does that go? And I think your question, Denny, is really right on spot, and that is that if we're really headed toward the end, or at least a setup for the end, this all is working in the same, let's say, direction, and they're not independent of each other. That Gog and Magog in the world, anti-Semitism, United States, Middle East, all of this is in play. And what we saw, and particularly as we talked with Eric and Rabbi at Frame, is, think about what's happened here since October 7th now, going on 2 years ago. Hamas, and we'll come back to Hamas, but Hamas is basically not in power at the moment. They still do stuff and they're hurting their country, but they're not attacking Israel. Hezbollah on the north of Lebanon, they're not hurting Israel at the moment, and we'll talk about that one because that one is interesting because the country that they're in, Lebanon, which is different than Hamas and Gaza, when we got to help people understand the difference. Lebanon is saying, you know what? We're sick of this. We're just going to kick them out. We're going to get rid of them. And of course, Hamas says, okay, or Hezbollah says, okay, we're going to kill you, everybody. And then Iran, which is the funder of all this, just got kind of decimated, and they're in trouble financially and with water, et cetera. So what'll happen there? So at the moment, I mean, think of what's happened in 2 years. For the first time in a long, I mean, ever since they were formed up, now 80 years ago, they don't have anybody locally that can really attack them or is attacking them militarily. And and then while that's going on, you got this whole world scenario going on. So how is it going to play out? I see it kind of marching together forward in terms of the outcome of, and we got to watch Russia and US. And all of us, I think, need to be careful to assume, because Trump's been successful in all these other things, that he'll be successful with Russia. I don't necessarily think that's going to happen the way that we think it would happen. And then in the meantime, the Middle East isn't going to be nothing. It's going to be very, very significant. So yeah, it's going to be an interesting thing, Denny, to watch. And as you get some more insight on it, we'll have you weigh in on that, because I thought your observation on that was pretty right on spot.
Yeah, it's also, so just yesterday, the reporting began that Netanyahu has announced the move into Gaza City. That now, and you think about what you just said, Rich, that all of these distractions all around the world attention moves off of this, other than protests here and there, and probably a lot in Israel continuing. But meanwhile, that's exactly the moment where Netanyahu says, we're going to go in and we're going to begin this operation. And so the question of the safety of the hostages, is now back on the table. Israel military troops being successful or not, maybe some military deaths there, more protests. So we're really seeing just the beginning of the final stage of military action in Gaza, and what happens in the aftermath. That's all we talked about a month ago.
Yeah.
Now that's sort of a sideshow.
Yeah. So let's talk about that a little bit. We Eric and Rabbi talked about the fact that they have a dilemma. There's still hostages there that they'd like to recover, and people's lives matter. So that's a big deal. Probably, I think Eric said there's only like 20 to 25 left. Isn't that a statement?
20 maybe. It's been reported at 20.
Yeah, 20, and that means they recovered. There was like 250 to start. About 100 have come back. About 100 and some have been killed, and now they've got 20 left. But those lives matter. So the dilemma is, Hamas knows this, is we're not going to release them until you give us what we want. So they're fighting, for their position, which is we want, to remain, and we want to rearm and all that. And of course, Netanyahu and then Israel said, no, we're not going to do it. So they've decided they're going to go occupy again Gaza. And occupy doesn't mean, and Eric helped us understand this, wasn't we're going to have people move into Gaza. We're going to just go and militarily be on what they call these routes that start to control the activity of Gaza, and primarily for two purposes. One, to prevent Hamas from regaining any kind of power, and two is to get aid to the people that need it, because Hamas is stopping it and stealing it and or killing people who are trying to get it. So Denny, based on what you know, and we know that there's this dilemma of what they should do, what have you heard they are going to do, and where do you think that'll go in terms of just the impact on what actually happens in Gaza when Israel says we're sending troops back in, which they're doing now. And so the for the disputes that are there, and I guess they're just they're as big as ever, the protests in Israel, just release the hostages. I mean, just declare a ceasefire. It's always that, just declare a ceasefire, pull back. We can get the hostages released, and we can always go back in and take care of the remnant of Hamas later. But the problem is that there was an agreement that came out of either Qatar or one of the other countries, maybe even Egypt, that was part of this, that was proposed. And this time Hamas said, we agree, we will sign this agreement.
and Israel did not. Now, they didn't say no, they just announced we're moving in. So to me, this suggests that, and I think that agreement had 10 of the 20 hostages released in exchange for a few thousand Palestinian prisoners. It was one of those. And so I think we've been hearing this from Eric all along. Hamas will never give up all of the prisoners. It'll be all right, half of what's left, half of what's left, half of what's left. And from Israel's standpoint, even if there's no surviving and 10 remains, that's not enough for them to say, well, then now we'll go in and blow the place up. So we know that what's going to happen is Hamas will never yield enough for a true ceasefire and peace.
Right.
And so it feels to me like that's become so self-evident to Netanyahu that, we're going to deal with it, that, their move now is going to be slow and steady, but they're not going to yield. And so I think we may start seeing world reaction that Israel, instead of accepting a peace or a ceasefire agreement that Hamas was willing to accept, Israel said no and went and picked up its arms again. And so we may see a new spate of anti-Israel, especially if people start being killed and there's more pictures of starving people and all of that.
What do you predict if they go in and do it? What do you think will happen just in Gaza itself? And then let's talk more about the world reaction to that.
Well, I think Israel has shown itself to be pretty good on this in this kind of combat. And so I guess I'm thinking more that they'll be relatively successful in taking over the city. I can't imagine there's not going to be more loss. It's just hard to picture that, because what they say is, and what Eric has confirmed, is that the IDF knows where these hostages are, and they're in impossible to retrieve locations, surrounded by guards who will torture and kill them as soon as they're threatened. So we may be seeing some of that play out. But it may be that, when it's all said and done, you weigh the possibilities. And, Israel has shown a lot of restraint for 2 years. And now we're down to this last little piece. Doesn't seem to be a worldwide solution. Nobody seems to want to come in and say, we'll negotiate a settlement of Gaza. Nobody's willing to do that. The only leader that has said they'll do that is Trump. Will rebuild it, or the Muslim Brotherhood, who's just more of the same. And so it sort of feels to me like Israel has, or at least the leadership has, come to the conclusion there is just no other way but to by force.
Yeah. Now, will and I read this article, I think out of the Wall Street Journal, that said that now remember, Eric portrayed clearly that the citizens of Gaza are per se terrorists themselves, in terms of their mentality, is that they want to eliminate Israel, and anything they can do to do that, they will do. But because they're starving and they need help, they recognize that the Hamas is actually preventing them from getting some aid.
Yeah.
And they're and obviously that bothers you as a person when I have kids and wives and stuff, and like, hey, they need food and you're preventing me from doing it. You know what? I'm sick of this. Okay, given that, which is an interesting, kind of dynamic that we haven't seen before. If Israel goes in, are they going to be able to successfully open up the aid flow? And will that give any positive thoughts, at least from the people who are getting the aid, toward Israel?
Yeah, so we've heard described, these aid centers are far away from population areas. It's hard to get to them. They're like military zones surrounded in barbed wire, gunners on cranes. So if they were able to move right into central Gaza and clear a safe passage behind them, in theory, they could set up local humanitarian aid that's visible to the population. Again, because I think going in with a military operation is already dangerous. So the idea of adding some kind of humanitarian aid behind it it's not a crazy thought, Rich. That may be how they win over the locals as they move in.
Yeah.
Some of them. I think you're right. It's long term. It's hopeless because they've all been so behavior modified for generations.
Yeah. And talk briefly about, that when we think of war, usually when somebody says, okay, we won, the other side surrenders and, okay, we'll do something different now. In this case, and this is the problem with the Middle East, is that, and Eric keeps reminding us of this, and Rabbi, is that it's never going to end because it's an ideology that is so entrenched that even if Hamas is kind of decimated, which they are, and even further maybe coming up, that does not end their desire to rearm and redo things and cause trouble, even against their own country. So what do you see as where does it play out if they go in for 2 or 3 months and they actually start to have some, quote, success? But where does that ultimately going to go with Gaza?
I think some of that is what do they mean by occupy and for how long? So to the extent Israel has done something new here, which they have, this declaration we're going to occupy, if their view is we're going to have enough defenses in the area to protect the boundaries until someone rises up that says we will form a government here and we will oversee it. And so that's one answer to that question may be that Israel just says we're going to be that protective body. We'll control the borders. We'll continue to arrest people that that break the law, and we'll start the process of organizing a way for people to, problem is there's no commerce in Gaza. There is nothing of an economy. There's still very tribal, I guess. And without their neighbors, without the direct neighbors, Egypt, for example, wanting to say we'll extend our Egyptian control into that area, without somebody saying that, there is nobody at this point except Israel, maybe the United States. If Israel could secure it, maybe the United States will begin a rebuilding effort, but nobody's going to want to put money into rebuilding that area unless there's a reason to believe it's going to be
Yeah. So what you're saying is it sounds like there actually won't be, a restoration of Gaza. Israel probably will just have to, however they define occupation, will just have to occupy. That'll be it. And they probably won't back away from that, right? Because they would be concerned if they did. Again, the aid would stop and Hamas would try to come back and do it. And probably there's not going to be much success with any more hostages left because there's no reason for anybody or Hamas to surrender them because they're just going to, through attrition, and they don't care about people anyway, just go that way. So it'll be interesting to watch. Anything particular that you recommend we observe here in the next month or two of what will have any help us understand or interpret things?
Well, clearly following the daily success or struggles with this operation. They began it yesterday, I believe. So there should be some news sources we can follow about how are they doing. Are they clearing areas? Are they declaring them safe zones? So that would be most important. I don't expect that there's going to be a lot of conversation out of Washington, D.C. on this because the news cycle is going to be dominated with Ukraine, Russia. I think I'm always watching the reaction of the Jewish community here. And there's not a lot of big protests, but they are happening. But that's dropped down. But there's the amount of hatred that's taking place, sort of watching that. Let me think. I just don't expect a lot of other international interest because all of Europe is focused on Ukraine. And so it's all down to Netanyahu. And then, of course, any status on hostages, I think unfortunately, I think there may be, some sad developments on the hostages because I think they're just in such a precarious place.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Denny, so much for kind of bringing some clarity to some of this. And we'll continue with next session talking about Hezbollah and Iran and two-state solution. And we got lots to talk about. So we look forward to it. Thank you so much, Denny, for your willingness and helping us to clarify all this. And it's kind of funny. We can get a little bit of, okay, we think we see where it's going to go, but it is so complicated and there's so many variables that we can't really predict all that's going to happen. So we just have to watch it and then keep knowing what's going to happen. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks so much for joining us, Denny. If you have questions, listeners, from what you heard today, be sure to send them in to us at questions@abideministries.com. And we look forward to seeing you next time.
Yep, see you then.
Thank you for joining us for today's episode of Come and See, your podcast for truth in a world of chaos. Brought to you by Living Waters Abide Ministries. Send us your questions and comments and tune in tomorrow for more answers to your personal questions about living life in God's truth. Remember, God's will is best and none better. His truth brings peace in this world of chaos.